The town noticed the bikes before it noticed the silence. Engines rolled low and steady, not racing, not showing off, just present in a way that made people pause without knowing why. Sound settled into the street like weight. Conversations thinned. Doors didn't close, but they didn't open wider either. Everything slowed by half a breath. Steven stood near the curb, not in the middle of anything, not trying to be seen. Jacket pulled tighter than the weather required, shoulders slightly rounded, as if the air itself might press too hard. His hands stayed low, close to his sides, fingers flexing once, then still again. The bruises on his knuckles were easy to miss if you weren't looking for them. Old enough to have faded into yellow and purple, new enough to still carry shape. They didn't look dramatic, they looked lived with. Cars passed. Tires whispered over asphalt. Someone laughed a little too loudly from across the street and then stopped. Steven shifted his weight, favoring one side, heel lifting and settling again. A small movement. The kind people make when they're managing something instead of ignoring it. His eyes stayed forward. Not searching, not challenging, just fixed on nothing in particular. The bikes rolled closer. Chrome caught the light and let it go. Leather creaked. No one revved, no one called out. The sound wasn't aggressive, but it wasn't friendly either. It was controlled. The kind of sound that says someone is paying attention. A few people turned away early, pretending they hadn't noticed anything at all. A few watched from behind glass, faces half hidden by reflections. Someone reached for their phone and thought better of it. Steven didn't look toward the bikes. He felt them. The way you feel weather before it changes. The leader rode slightly ahead of the others, not by much. He didn't scan the street the way men looking for trouble do. His gaze moved slow, taking in posture, spacing, the way bodies occupied ground. When his eyes passed over Steven, they didn't stop. Not yet. They continued on, then came back, settling there as if they had found a familiar shape. Steven's jaw tightened for a second. Just enough to notice if you knew what to watch. He pulled his jacket a fraction closer, knuckles brushing fabric, bruises disappearing again. The street held its breath without realizing it had done so. The biker gang leader slowed his bike without signaling. Not sharp, not sudden, just enough to fall out of the rhythm of the street. The engine dropped to a softer note, still running, still steady. He didn't look directly at Steven right away. He let his eyes move past him, across storefronts, down the line of parked cars, over the shapes of people pretending to stay busy. It wasn't avoidance. It was patience. He had learned long ago that staring too fast made people lie with their bodies. If you wanted the truth, you gave it room to show itself. Steven stood where he was, feeling the change before he saw it. The sound of the bikes wasn't closer, but it felt nearer somehow. The leader's gaze returned, slower this time, landing without pressure. Not a challenge, not a warning, just attention. The leader took in the small things first. The way Steven held his shoulders slightly forward, like someone used to absorbing contact. The way his feet were set uneven, weight favoring one side without drama. No show of fear, no show of confidence either. Just management, the quiet kind. He noticed the hands next. Not because they were raised or clenched, but because they weren't. They hung close to Steven's body, fingers loose but ready. Knuckles still carrying color that hadn't finished fading. The marks didn't shout. They didn't need to. They sat there like punctuation at the end of a sentence no one had read out loud. The leader kept his face neutral, no narrowing of the eyes, no change in his mouth. Years had worn that habit into him. Reaction was information. Control was choice. He rolled another foot forward, boot skimming the pavement, bike barely moving now. The other riders felt it and adjusted without being told. Distance closed just enough to matter, not enough to crowd. They watched him more than they watched Steven, waiting for something that hadn't been given yet. The leader tilted his head slightly, not as a signal, just a habit when he was listening to what wasn't being said. Steven's breathing was steady, but shallow. The rise and fall of his chest stopped for a beat when the leader's eyes settled fully on him, then resumed, slower, measured, not panic. Calculation. That mattered. People who expected violence breathed differently. People who had already been through it learned how to make each breath count. The leader let the bike idle. He didn't kill the engine yet. Ending sound too early could feel like a move. He wanted none of that. This wasn't a moment for performance. It was a moment for clarity. Steven finally glanced up, just once, eyes flicking to the leader and away again. Not defiant, not submissive. A check. A quiet question that didn't ask for help and didn't refuse it either. The leader saw that too. He had seen it on men twice Steven's size, and on people who carried their pain in places you couldn't point to. It was the look of someone deciding whether the world was about to ask more than they had left to give. The leader rested one hand on the handlebar. Fingers relaxed, not gripping. His shoulders stayed loose. No tension traveled down his arms. Anyone watching closely would notice how little space he took up for a man built like him, how he let the moment come to him instead of stepping into it. Steven shifted again, heel lifting, settling. A small adjustment. The leader clocked it, filed it away. Pain managed, not denied. Injury acknowledged, not displayed. The street continued around them. A door closed softly. Wind moved a scrap of paper along the curb. Somewhere a radio played and then went quiet. None of it pulled the leader's focus away. He had seen enough now. Not everything, not the whole story, but enough to know this wasn't noise. This wasn't coincidence. This was something that had weight, and weight deserved to be handled carefully. He eased the bike to a stop. Engine still running. Foot down. Balance steady. He stayed there, giving nothing away, letting Steven know without words that he had been seen. No one explained anything out loud. That was the strange part. The street didn't pause for a story. There was no announcement, no accusation, no defense offered into the open air. What surrounded Steven wasn't information. It was assumption. The quiet kind people learned to live with. The marks on his hands didn't come with a timeline. They didn't say where they started or how they ended. They didn't point to a single moment you could isolate and deal with. They just existed. That made them inconvenient. Inconvenient things tend to be ignored. Most people have learned how to do that without thinking. You see something that doesn't fit neatly into your day, and your eyes slide past it, not because you're cruel, because stopping feels like choosing a side, and choosing a side feels expensive. Steven stood inside that space, not asking for anything, not offering anything either. Just occupying ground with a history no one had requested. The kind of history that doesn't ask permission to be visible. A few feet away, conversations continued in fragments. Not about him, about errands, about weather, about plans that still made sense. Words floated, but they avoided the center of the street the way water avoids heat. The bruises on Steven's knuckles weren't dramatic enough to shock anyone into action. They didn't demand urgency. They didn't bleed. They didn't swell. They sat there quietly, the way consequences do after the moment has already passed. People are good at telling themselves stories when no one speaks. Someone probably thought he'd been careless. Someone else decided it was personal business. Another figured there was more to it, always more, enough to justify distance. None of these thoughts were shared. They didn't need to be. The unasked context filled the space anyway. Steven adjusted his stance again, subtle, almost automatic. His body knew where it hurt even if no one else acknowledged it. He didn't cradle his hands. He didn't hide them either. They stayed where they were, part of him, not an announcement. Across the street, a woman slowed her step, looked once, then focused very hard on the ground in front of her. A man leaned against a doorway, arms crossed, gaze fixed on the leader's bike instead. Someone else watched everything with interest until it felt too much like responsibility, then looked away. No one said, "Are you okay?" No one said, "What happened?" No one said, "Do you need help?" Silence is easier when it feels shared. Steven's breathing stayed even. He had learned how to do that. How to keep the outside calm so the inside didn't spill into places it couldn't be taken back from. His jaw tightened again, just briefly, then eased. A habit more than a reaction. The street had seen men like him before. Not Steven specifically, but the shape of him. The posture, the quiet. The way pain sat in the body without permission. Towns learn how to recognize that shape, and they also learn how to pretend they don't. Because once you see it clearly, you have to decide what it means about you. The leader remained where he was, bike idling, watching without interruption. He didn't fill the silence. He let it show itself. Around him, the other riders stayed still, following the same unspoken rule. No noise, no motion. Let the moment speak. Steven felt the weight of being observed without being questioned. It was different from being ignored. More exposed, more honest. He shifted his hands slightly, flexing his fingers once, then stilling them again. The bruises caught the light and then didn't. The air held. This was the space where most things usually ended. Not with resolution, with avoidance. People would go home later and remember there had been a moment when something could have happened. They would remember it vaguely, without details softened by time before it ever hardened into regret. The unasked context depended on that softness. Steven looked ahead, eyes unfocused, as if the street extended farther than it actually did. He didn't search for help. He didn't brace for harm. He stood exactly where he was, letting whatever came next arrive on its own terms. And in that quiet stretch of time, with no one explaining and no one demanding, the town was left alone with itself. Do you step closer or step back? The leader cut the engine. Not abruptly. Just a clean turn of the wrist, the sound fading instead of stopping. The street noticed that more than it noticed him. Noise had been doing the talking until then. When it disappeared, attention had nowhere else to go. He didn't step off the bike right away. He stayed seated for a moment, boots planted, balance easy, posture loose. Nothing about him leaned forward. Nothing pulled back. It wasn't hesitation. It was intention. Steven felt the change before he understood it. The absence of sound pressed differently than the presence of it had. His shoulders lifted slightly, then settled again. He didn't turn. He didn't brace. He waited. When the leader finally swung one leg over and stood, it was unhurried. No sharp movements. No claiming of space. He closed the distance by only a step, maybe two, stopping well short of where pressure would begin. The gap between them stayed open, wide enough to breathe in. People nearby watched for the usual signs. Raised voices. Squared shoulders. A look that asked for trouble. None of it came. The leader's hands stayed visible, empty. One resting loosely near his belt, the other hanging at his side. No pointing. No folding of arms. Nothing defensive. Nothing aggressive. He spoke then. Not loud, not quiet enough to feel secret. Just a normal voice, the kind people use when they don't expect an argument. It didn't carry across the street. It didn't need to. It was meant for one person and anyone close enough to be honest. Steven turned this time. Slowly. Cautious, but not alarmed. His eyes met the leader's and stayed there longer than before. Not because he was reassured. Because he was trying to understand the shape of what was happening. The leader didn't ask for explanations. He didn't ask for details. He didn't frame the moment as a problem to be solved. His words didn't lean toward blame or sympathy. They landed in the space between neutral and steady. That was unfamiliar. Most people who approached pain did it one of two ways. They rushed in with concern that felt heavy, or they circled it with suspicion. This was neither. This was an acknowledgement without demand. Steven swallowed once. His hands shifted slightly, then went still again. He wasn't being cornered. He wasn't being rescued. He was being addressed like a person whose agency still mattered. Around them, the riders stayed where they were. No one dismounted late. No one adjusted position to block sightlines. Their presence didn't tighten, it settled. A collective cue taken from the man who hadn't raised his voice. The leader's eyes stayed level with Steven's, not scanning, not assessing for weakness, just present. His face didn't soften into something rehearsed. It stayed neutral, open enough to invite, firm enough to hold. Steven's breathing changed, not dramatically, just enough to notice if you were watching closely. The shallow edge eased off. A fraction more air moved in and out of his chest. He nodded once. Not agreement. Recognition. The street felt it. The difference between tension and attention is subtle, but people sense it even if they can't name it. Conversations didn't resume, but they didn't freeze either. Life hovered, waiting to see which direction this would go. The leader shifted his weight, a small adjustment meant to stay comfortable, not to loom. He didn't step closer. He didn't step away. He let the distance remain a choice rather than a threat. Steven spoke again briefly. His voice didn't carry far. It wasn't meant to. He didn't explain everything. He didn't need to. The leader listened without interrupting. No nodding for show. No expressions meant to signal judgment or approval. When Steven finished, there was a pause. Not the awkward kind. The kind that respects what's just been said. The leader responded in the same tone he'd started with. No escalation. No reassurance that promised more than it could deliver. Just clarity. Just steadiness. The kind that doesn't try to own the moment. Steven's shoulders dropped a little, not relief. Release. The difference matters. Relief depends on outcomes. Release depends on being heard. The leader took a half step back then, just enough to return space instead of taking it. A quiet signal that the ground Steven stood on was still his. The street stayed quiet, not because it was afraid, because it was paying attention. Nothing had been resolved. Nothing had been claimed. But something had shifted, subtle and undeniable, carried not by force or volume, but by the simple decision to approach without taking over. The air didn't snap. It didn't crack, it loosened. You could feel it before you could explain it. That tight buzz that had been sitting on everyone's shoulders started to thin out. Not gone, just lighter, like someone opened a window you didn't realize was closed. People shifted without meaning to. A foot moved. A jaw unclenched. Someone let out a breath they hadn't planned on releasing. The street stayed quiet, but the silence changed shape. It wasn't holding its breath anymore. Authority was still there. That mattered. Nothing about the scene turned soft or careless. The bikes were still lined up. The presence was still solid. But the sharp edge people expect never arrived. And without it, the moment started to feel heavier in a different way. Steven noticed it. He didn't relax completely. He didn't smile. But his body stopped preparing for impact. His hands rested where they were instead of hovering unsure. His weight settled evenly on both feet. Small things. The kind that only happen when the nervous system decides it's allowed to pause. The leader didn't fill the space with words. He didn't need to. Calm has its own gravity. It doesn't pull fast, it pulls deep. Nearby faces changed. Not dramatically, just enough. Eyes stopped darting. Brows eased. A few people who had been half-turned, ready to move if things went sideways, faced forward again. Not because they were bored. Because the threat level had dropped without anyone saying it out loud. Power usually announces itself. This didn't. That's what made it unsettling in a quiet way. There was no performance to react to. No aggression to mirror. No volume to push against. Just steadiness sitting there, refusing to escalate. The leader's posture stayed the same. Upright but loose. Grounded. He didn't puff up. He didn't shrink. He looked like someone who didn't need the moment to go any particular way to be okay. Steven glanced around once. Quick. Instinctive. He wasn't looking for an exit. He was checking the temperature of the room, the way people do when something unexpected happens. What he saw didn't add pressure. It took some away. The air kept shifting. You could almost hear it, like a low hum fading out. The kind of change that doesn't demand attention but earns it. Authority that stays calm does something strange. It removes excuses. There's nothing to fight. Nothing to rebel against. No emotional spike to ride. All that's left is the reality of the moment, bare and quiet. Does calm authority feel stronger? The question didn't need to be spoken aloud to land. It sat there anyway, hanging in the space between the people watching and the people involved. Some felt it in their chest. Others felt it in the back of their neck. A few didn't like it at all. Because calm doesn't give you somewhere to put your anger. Steven's face didn't harden. It didn't soften either. It stayed honest. And honesty, when it's not being forced, can be disarming. He wasn't being challenged to prove anything. He wasn't being pushed into submission. He was just there. The leader held eye contact without locking it in. He looked away occasionally, not to disengage, but to show there was no trap. No dominance game being played. No silent countdown ticking in his head. The bike stayed still. Engines off. No revving. No impatience leaking through. That mattered more than people realized. Noise is often used to remind others who's in control. The lack of it sent a clearer message. Time stretched a little. Not in a tense way. In a way that let people catch up to what had already shifted. Someone across the street resumed tying their shoe. A small act, but telling. Normal behavior returning is one of the first signs that fear is losing its grip. Another person checked their phone, then stopped, realizing they didn't need the distraction anymore. Steven breathed again. Deeper this time. He didn't speak, he didn't need to. The moment wasn't asking for more words. The leader adjusted his stance, easing pressure off one leg. A human movement. Ordinary. It reminded everyone that control didn't require stiffness. That strength didn't mean freezing yourself into a statue. The air kept settling, layer by layer. What had felt like a standoff now felt like a pause with weight. A pause that could hold different outcomes without forcing any of them. No one clapped. No one laughed it off. There was no release valve like that. This kind of shift doesn't explode outward. It sinks in. And as it did, the street learned something without being taught. That authority doesn't always arrive loud. That sometimes the most powerful thing in the room is the person who refuses to add fuel, even when they could. The town didn't gather in one place. It gathered in fragments. Windows held faces. Doorways held pauses. Cars slowed without stopping. People pretended to check messages, adjust mirrors, tie laces, all while keeping the scene in the corner of their vision. No one wanted to stare. Everyone wanted to know. This was the kind of moment that spreads without moving. A shared awareness, quiet and contagious. You could feel it passing from one person to the next, not through words, but through posture. Through the way shoulders angled. Through how long people stayed still before deciding what to do next. A shop bell chimed somewhere down the block. The sound cut through, then faded. No one flinched. That alone said something. Fear usually jumps at small noises. This didn't. People noticed the details they normally miss. The spacing between bodies. The way no one crowded Steven. The way the leader didn't claim the center of the street. Didn't take more space than necessary. These things landed even if no one consciously named them. A woman across the way folded her arms, then slowly let them drop. An older man leaned on his cane and didn't shift his weight this time. Two teenagers whispered, then stopped whispering, as if they realized there was nothing to narrate yet. The town watched because it didn't know how to label what it was seeing. This wasn't a confrontation the way stories usually tell it. There was no shouting to interpret, no sudden movement to replay later. That made it harder to simplify, harder to turn into gossip, and that unsettled people more than drama ever does. Steven remained where he was. He didn't become the center, but he didn't disappear either. The town noticed that too. How he wasn't being overshadowed. How he wasn't being framed as small. He existed in the moment without being reduced by it. The leader stayed visible but unintrusive. Not hiding. Not looming. Just present. That balance held attention in a way force never could. People didn't look away because they were scared. They looked away because they were processing. A few phones came out. A few went back into pockets. Recording felt wrong somehow, like trying to trap something that wasn't meant to be flattened into a clip. The moment didn't perform. It resisted being captured. Kids sensed it before adults did. A child tugged on a sleeve and was gently hushed, not out of panic, but out of instinct. The adults didn't want to interrupt whatever this was becoming, even if they couldn't explain why. Time moved strangely. Minutes felt stretched thin, then thick again. No one checked the clock. No one announced how long it had been. The town slipped into a shared now, something rare and fragile. People who had lived there their whole lives felt it register against memory. This street had seen noise. It had seen chaos. It had seen authority arrive loud and leave louder. This was different, and different sticks. Someone across the street made eye contact with someone else watching and gave a slight nod. Not agreement. Recognition. A silent acknowledgement that they were witnessing the same thing, even if they didn't know what it meant yet. The town didn't lean forward waiting for a blow. It leaned inward, listening. Listening for tone. For intention. For what would happen without being forced to happen. The lack of escalation became the story before there was a story. People felt it settle into them, that absence. It challenged expectations they didn't know they carried. About bikers. About bruises. About how power usually shows up. Steven's stillness became part of the landscape. Not frozen, anchored. The town saw the way he didn't try to win the crowd. Didn't seek sympathy, didn't shrink. That quiet dignity reframed him without a word spoken. The leader's calm reframed everything else. People who came expecting tension found themselves unsure what emotion to hold instead. Relief didn't quite fit. Neither did excitement. What they felt was closer to clarity, though they wouldn't have used that word. A delivery truck idled at the end of the block and then shut off its engine. The driver waited, not because he was told to, because the moment asked for patience, and somehow he heard it. The town watched, not as spectators but as witnesses. There's a difference. Spectators wait for an outcome. Witnesses absorb a shift. This wasn't about who would leave first or who would speak next. It was about the space being held without collapsing, about restraint being visible, about something potentially volatile choosing not to ignite. People would talk about this later. They would disagree on details, on what it meant, on who had the upper hand. But right now, none of that existed yet. Only the shared observation. The town stayed still a little longer than necessary, as if moving too soon might break the spell, as if whatever lesson was forming needed a few more seconds to set. And in that stillness, everyone watching understood the same unspoken thing. This moment mattered, even if they couldn't yet say why. The aftermath didn't explode. It settled quietly like dust after wind passes. No one shouted. No one ran, no sirens pierced the night. The air simply carried the weight of what had passed, and the town felt it press lightly, insistently, against the backs of anyone still lingering. People moved, but slower, carefully. They didn't need to speak. The change had already been absorbed without announcement. Steven stayed where he had been, bruised but upright, letting the presence of the leader frame him instead of fear. He didn't raise his voice, didn't demand recognition. The town noticed how he carried himself without protest, the way restraint can speak louder than any shout. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about endurance, presence, the quiet acknowledgement that power can exist without being loud. The leader didn't patrol or preach. He didn't gloat or explain. His calm presence carried authority without performance. A few bikers lingered on the edges trying to weigh the situation, but they found no opening, no spark to latch onto. Their usual gestures of dominance were absorbed and neutralized by quiet awareness. Every movement measured, every shift deliberate, yet almost invisible unless you were watching closely. People began to notice patterns in the silence. How a small motion of a hand could redirect tension. How the tilt of a head could communicate without words. How proximity alone could assert protection. The town didn't see a fight. They saw a system of control that didn't need noise to function. They saw that consequence could exist without spectacle. Phones were lowered, not because instructions were given, but because the moment had claimed their attention more fully than any screen could. Even those who had expected a scene, a spectacle, found themselves observing the subtle choreography of restraint. Every glance, every step, every slight adjustment carried meaning. The town felt it, even if they couldn't articulate it. It registered in posture, in breath, in the way the body holds tension and then releases it slowly. Businesses reopened their doors, but the rhythm of the street had shifted. A shopkeeper adjusted a sign and paused to glance across the block. A car rolled by more slowly than usual. Pedestrians walked deliberately, noticing the distance between themselves and others, respecting the invisible boundaries that had formed. The lesson was subtle, but it was there. Steven moved finally but deliberately. Each step measured, not defensive, not aggressive. The leader mirrored the motion, not to command but to accompany. No theatrics, no challenge, only presence. The crowd, the town, the bikers, all responded to that quiet structure of accountability. Actions spoke louder than words, and here actions were precise, controlled, deliberate. Conversations restarted softly, among neighbors and bystanders, but the tone was different. Not casual chatter, not idle gossip, but observant, reflective. People recounted what they saw without embellishment. They noticed the restraint. They noticed that no one had overstepped, that no one had been humiliated publicly. The story would travel, but stripped of drama, carrying weight instead of spectacle. Documents were exchanged quietly later, phone calls logged and noted, actions documented. Every step that needed follow-through was handled without theatrics. No raised voices, no demands, no bluster. The consequences landed in place, steady, measured, inevitable. The town understood that this type of resolution held power in its predictability and clarity, not in noise. Even in the coming days, the street itself seemed changed. Steps fell differently on the pavement. People lingered in doorways, glancing subtly at spaces where authority had asserted itself without aggression. They remembered the quiet enforcement of consequence, the way restraint had shaped the scene. The lesson wasn't loud. It was absorbed, folded into daily awareness. By nightfall, the echoes of the event had faded, but the effect lingered. No celebration, no fanfare, just a sense of balance restored. People left knowing that power could be exercised without spectacle, that accountability didn't require forceful drama, that presence and patience could carry the same weight as action. The consequences were clear. The lessons were felt. And the town had witnessed it all without a single shout. The streets of the town returned to their usual rhythm, but something lingered in the air. People walked with a quieter awareness, their steps measured, their eyes scanning not for drama but for understanding. Conversations that once rushed past trivialities now paused, stretched, and weighed each word. The memory of what had happened didn't announce itself loudly, but it pressed lightly on everyone who had been near enough to notice. Steven's bruises, the leader's calm, the way nothing exploded, it had all left an impression deeper than most expected. Shops reopened. Doors creaked, windows reflected the pale sun, and the usual bustle began to fold back into place. Yet even as life carried on, there was a subtle shift. People remembered the presence that had commanded respect without noise, the balance that had been restored without spectacle. In small ways, the town carried the lesson forward. A shopkeeper lingered longer on the threshold, scanning the street before stepping fully out. A group of teenagers slowed as they passed the corner where the confrontation had been most visible, their shoulders easing slightly, as if unconsciously absorbing the calm authority that had been present. Phones had stopped recording, but the memory replayed constantly in the minds of those who had watched. Every small movement, every glance, every gesture of restraint had been logged silently. People discussed it in whispers, quietly, analyzing the weight of actions over words. They noticed how presence alone could hold power, how calm could outweigh aggression, and how consequences could land without spectacle. The stories grew in depth, not exaggeration. They weren't tales of chaos or fear. They were recollections of measured authority and the invisible scaffolding that had held it all together. Steven moved among people carefully, still feeling the ache in his body, still carrying the memory of every step he had taken during that moment. He didn't seek attention. He didn't explain. He simply existed within the space that had shifted around him, a living reminder of restraint and endurance. Others adjusted unconsciously, stepping aside, lowering their voices, holding their movements with more thought than before. The town had learned to feel the weight of presence. Do moments like this change a town permanently, or only until the memory fades? That question lingered unspoken in many minds. People caught themselves reflecting on it in the quiet of their homes, in the pause between tasks, in the slow walk to familiar places. Some wondered if the lesson would endure, folded into the town's rhythm, shaping future actions without anyone declaring it. Others feared it might fade, the lesson dissolving as quickly as shadows under the sun. The uncertainty didn't erase the memory. It amplified the attention given to small actions, to the balance of restraint and awareness in everyday life. Over the following days, the town seemed to carry itself differently. Streets once noisy now held pockets of pause. Conversations slowed. Gestures were measured. Authority was acknowledged not by words but by presence. People noticed subtleties they might have ignored before: the tilt of a head, the angle of a hand, the space someone held around themselves. In ways both small and large, the town absorbed the echoes of what had happened, letting them shape behavior without overt commands. Steven's body healed, but the memory remained embedded in his posture, in the way he walked, in the quiet attentiveness he carried. The leader, too, continued without fanfare, presence sustained without spectacle, offering lessons not in words but in every calm movement. The town watched, absorbed, and carried forward an awareness that was quiet yet profound. By the time the sun set again over familiar rooftops, the town had returned to a semblance of routine. Yet the memory of what had unfolded persisted in subtle ways: gestures, pauses, awareness of space, and the quiet understanding that power and consequence did not require aggression to exist. The impact was gentle but unmistakable, a lingering force that shaped interactions and framed choices. People didn't talk about it loudly, but everyone who had been there knew it had happened, and that knowledge quietly changed the way the town moved forward.